And in particular, today we look at this period of history in our community. I'm not sure if the slides are working. I hope they are, because I cannot see them. And if not, that's fine. It's not an issue. We will try and do without the technology. We used to do that before, so I'm sure we can. Those of you who used to use calculators can still add up, so at least our elders can. Alhamdulillah. Okay. So I want the very first slide for the organizers to say the Uganda Exodus 40 years on is really the subject. And today we remember those marhumin who came here as part of that Exodus to make a new life. And indeed, these are the marhumin we also remember, because our community has had numerous instances where we were displaced. We remember after the revolution in Zanzibar that Mu'mineen had to flee for their respect, for their izzat, for their lives, and they were displaced from Zanzibar. And then, of course, in 1972, which is 40 years from today, that we as a community were displaced from Uganda. And later on, as we know, that we had Mu'mineen who were displaced from Somalia. And when the Khoja Shia Ethnic community, which has no land truly that it can call its own, which hardly now has a language that it can call its own, the Imam Barga and the Jamaat is our home and is our territory. And when we are displaced from them, we are not truly displaced because we come to another place and we recreate our Jamaat, we recreate our institutions. And this is, inshallah, the pattern that we have, that whenever there has been a displacement, this community has come together on its own to be able to resettle itself in the best way that it has possibly can. And indeed, it is that we are here to honor today. And just a little bit, next slide please, just a little bit to say that why do we need to mark these occasions? Kierkegaard, the Scandinavian philosopher, said that life must be lived forward but understood backwards. It is for that reason that history becomes an important thing, because sometimes we think we live in the present and we plan and worry about the future. Why bother with what has been? It's past now. It's gone. The whole point is that to answer that we must do so that we can gain access to the laboratory of human experience. Indeed, our faith teaches us over a third of the Holy Quran is history, so that we can learn from the past. And Mullah Nasruddin had a wonderful way of expressing what Kierkegaard said, that life must be lived forward but understood backward, because Mullah had an answer for every philosopher. Once he was seen riding a donkey backwards, and somebody said, Mullah, is that a way to ride a donkey? He said, yes, it's that, that I'm more interested in where I'm coming from than where I'm going. The idea of history becoming so important. And therefore, why should we concern ourselves to perpetuate the existence and development of the community is another question that we need to answer from history. What if we were to cease to exist as a community as such? These are the questions which become the incubator of our human experience, and particularly as the Khoja Shia Ethnic community. That from Hindus, we perhaps became Ismaili, then we took on the path of the Jafri faith. There are some who converted to be Ahl Sunnah. So today we have the Ismailiya Khojas, we have the Ithnashariya Khojas, and we also have Sunni Khojas. And it's that development which is truly a path of faith that we took. It is not my intent today to delve into the history, because I'm going to, inshallah, talk about a book that has been written after over a century of our existence, which is the most comprehensive book on the history of the Khoja that we will talk about a little later. And I'm hoping that Nazmul Bhai has kept its promise, and we have a few copies fresh off the presses for the Mu'mineen to be able to partake and perhaps even buy them. But we began our journey of faith 400 years ago or more with Pir Sadruddin, but it was not until 1856 that you have someone like Mullah Qadar Hussain Karbalai, who opens a madrasa in Mumbai to do tabligh amongst our people. In 1872, Haji Devji Jamal brings Mullah Qadar Hussain Karbalai back, and that's where we started our basis of tabligh. And in 1901, a major conflict happened where we separated from the Aga Khan, and we had two of our people who were martyred because they took the path of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. They were none other than Lalji Sajan and Hirji Ala Rakia, who were killed. And it was at that time, during that time, that the Jamaat in Mumbai was established. And once this cycle went on, the momentum began, and I say that the Jamaat fever kind of started spreading around the Khoja world, where we had the Jamaats being formed in Zanzibar and elsewhere. Indeed, the very first mosque that was established by the Khoja Shia Ethnicis happens to be in Zanzibar. And everywhere, the new Jamaat was being formed, and the movement became, going from the Jamaat Khana to the Imam Barga, began that track of our transformation towards the Jafri faith. These are the nuances of our history. This background was necessary to say that we took on a journey of faith. It was a journey of faith that we took as a community. And indeed, to do that, we needed certain instruments. And the book that I'm referring to is just being published today. In fact, this is the first public launch of that book, where in that book, the book, by the way, is called Endangered Species, and it is about the history and the journey of faith of the Khoja Shia Ethnic community. The book has 512 pages and over 2,500 references. Hassan Bhai Jafar, who himself hails, who is from the Devji Jamal family, has been in the kitchen of the Khoja Shia Ethnic community, so to speak, and has been able to bring us this rich recipe called Endangered Species. And I quote from that book, and he says that there was this idea of saying, when there is one Englishman, you have a gentleman. When you have two, we remember this in the colonial days, that when there are two, you have a club, and when there are three Englishmen, you have an empire. And he now paraphrases that about the Khoja, and he said, when you have one Khoja, you have a lonely individual. When you have two Khojas, there is a Jamaat, and when there are three Khojas, there is a federation. This happens to be a trait that we have followed over a period. Toronto Jamaat has a rich history, and I'll go into that a little bit. But I have elders here who know much more about this. But every Jamaat that was formed in the same way that Mullah Qadar Hussain Karbalai taught us how to do that, that the Thursday night Dua Kumel program begins in a home, and that transports into a Jamaat, into a federation, into a people that we are. It is the phase of the Majlis of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and the Dua Kumel taught to us by Imam Ali alayhi salam to say, these are the blessings that we have which become the genesis of the formation of a community, and therefore this community is one that embarked on a journey of faith. And that is a blessing, Mu'mineen, that we have. And let us look at the time as we come to the exodus from Uganda and what the people faced and how we replicated the actual way that we developed ourselves was no different from when 1856 in Gujarati, they used to call this Chapanyo Dukar. My elders would remember this, that 1856 was a period of trial and tribulations in Indian subcontinent, where the drought was such that either you died on land or you went across the ocean somewhere in search of some living and maybe perished at sea. That was a choice. And a lot of our people went forward towards the East African coast and further. And think of it. My young friends, think about this. You know, you said there is so much peer pressure in this society. The Canadian society, the environment here is a tough environment. Well, let me tell you, I've got news for you, my young friends, that our forefathers who actually migrated in those days from India to go elsewhere, they were subjected to a variety of influences. Here they had to come to an unexplored tract of land in the middle of the African and the Arab culture. And then what happened was they were subjected to the German rule in Tanganyika, the British rule in other parts of East Africa like Kenya, French rule in Madagascar, Italian rule in Somalia, Belgian rule in Congo, and the Portuguese rule in Mozambique. And yet we survived intact. With our kadi and khichdi, with our languages, with the culture that we had, we were able to survive intact despite all these influences. And this was a time, was not the time of the internet. This was not the time of the globalization as we know it. This was in isolation, totally cut off from the roots in India, and yet we were able to retain our culture and our identity, and there is a lesson of history that we need to learn when we look at our forefathers as to what they did. Of course, as I spoke, that from Africa around the world, that the upheaval in Zanzibar in 1964, in Uganda that we are here to talk about, in 1972, be it Mozambique, Madagascar, Congo, a wave of movement from the continent of Africa, even from Aden, actually took place. And of course, when we had the latest exodus that took place in 1990, when an entire community, Haji Sahib is sitting here, he will bear testimony that an entire community of 1,100 people were evacuated in a daring seaborne evacuation not known by any other community. It was, what was it? I began with the ayah to say that cooperate with each other, with bir and taqwa, and not with ism and udwan, not with sin and aggression. Mu'mineen, it is that level of compassion that we have for each other, where we cooperate in terms of bir and taqwa, in terms of goodness, piety, that brings us forth, and not cooperate with each other in sin and aggression. Mu'mineen, that is the story of compassion of this community. The compassion of the Khoja, Shia, Ethnic community for each other. You know the definition of compassion? Compassion is not pity. Compassion is not sympathy. Compassion is not many things that we sometimes think about. Compassion is something that we are taught by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He is Rahman. Whether you believe Him or not, He is still going to give you a risk. Whether you benefit from somebody or not, and yet you are compassionate, you feel their pain, is something that means that's compassion. And the best example that we can see of compassion in any human being is the mother. The mother suffers the fever of the child more than the child suffers. That is the quality of compassion that we have. A doctor sees fever, at least where I come from, in the land of Obamacare. When a doctor sees, he sees dollars. When he sees a child in fever, that doctor sees dollars. Forgive me if there are doctors here from the United States. Canada is different, I can assure you. The point is that when the mother sees that compassion, the mother feels the pain of the child. And that mother will do anything to try and alleviate the fever and the pain of the child. That is compassion. And that is what we, as a close-knit community, need to have for each other, to say we feel the pain of others. And when these displacements happen, that is a time that we are tested. And we were tested in several times, several ways. Was it, be it in Zanzibar, when people had to flee, there were people ready to try and do whatever they could to help. The risks that some mu'mineen took to try and get our young ladies out of that place and the other people out were tremendous risks. They took those risks because they had a compassion for the community. And then, of course, we had the Uganda exodus, the Somalia exodus that we had. It was that compassion, mu'mineen, and that is what we need to learn, that God forbid that there is another event where this community has to move over somewhere else then we need to learn that lesson to say that it is that compassion that is going to come to our rescue. Because I can tell you one thing, and I've said this as the president of the World Federation from this very podium, and I will repeat that once more. When the earthquake in Gujarat happened in 2001, when we had our people displaced because of the earthquake, Mu'mineen, there were no messages of sympathy, let alone messages of help from the rest of the Shia world. Suffice it to say that this community stood up with the people of Gujarat and Kutch during the time of that earthquake, and we were able to salvage and resettle that community all on our own. These are the nuances of history, and that is why it becomes so very interesting and important to try and learn from history. Today, we have members of the Khoja community who are found in New Zealand, in Australia, in Hong Kong, in Japan, in Singapore, East and Central Asia, Middle East, of course, Scandinavia, Europe, and of course, North America. A community of 125,000 people, and by some accounts, although this has been challenged now, hopefully this challenge is right, that we are 125,000 in a reducing community because our death rate is higher than our birth rate. A challenge to our young people to make sure that that doesn't happen. The point is that 125 or 130, that is what we are as a community. We need to have our institutions strong. God forbid, if this thing happens again, our community institutions, and we make those community institutions, be it Nasimco, be it our Jamaat in Toronto, be it the World Federation, be it the Gujarat Federation. These are the institutions that make us strong Mu'mineen, and that is why we need to have that sense of belonging. We need to have our young people all the more engaged, and that is the history that we need to continuously repeat, go on repeating, so that the young generation of this community understands the value of social capital. Social capital is that you have a network. I were to walk into a mosque or an Imam Barga in New Zealand, and I come to Toronto, I find no difference in the way that we conduct our affairs. It is almost like a franchise that we have all over the world. You go to Tananarive, or you go to Reunion Island, you go to Dar es Salaam, you go to London, you go to Bhavnagar, wherever you go, you know what to expect, and you pick up one phone call to one of the workers in that particular Jamaat, and they are there to say, you have come, you are our guest, what can we do for you? This social capital was not developed in isolation. This social capital, Mu'mineen, was developed because we had a basis of compassion for each other. And if that compassion is eroded because of the issues of globalization, and everybody has now become so busy with their own affairs that I don't have time, well, now we have even better tools. Doesn't matter if the Facebook shares are falling. The point is we have a phenomenal opportunity to be able to reconnect with each other, so that we as a community can play a role as we did. Coming to the event that we are here to remember, and let me just have a show of hands to say, how many Mu'mineen are present here who are actually part of that exodus in 1972? Let's have a show of hands. We have, and there are so many that you may remember, gentlemen and ladies, if they're listening to me, that there are so many who came with you who are no longer here. And that is the group that we are here to remember, to say that they did their bit. And then there were those who were here in Toronto when they came. How many of you here are present here to say that we actually received those displaced Mu'mineen coming from Uganda to actually, when they're coming here? Do we have anyone here, or few people who say we were here when they came? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the people who will tell you that it was that compassion, that when they were being received, people were here to say these people are coming. I know of a particular letter that was sent by one of the past presidents of Toronto Jamaat, Maroon Habib. When he sent, Mahmoud Habib, when he sent a letter to Kampala Jamaat, Hussein Bhai is sitting there, he'll bear me out. that he sent a letter to say that why do you not apply to the Canadian High Commission? There was no Canadian High Commission. It was the Aga Khan's office that was dealing with the Canadian applications. But here was a man, and of course his wife, and others who were with them, who had the compassion and felt enough to actually say that there are people out there, I can do something about them. And when these people came, and I've heard those accounts over a period of time, to say at least we found solace, that there was a warehouse that somebody had given, that majlises were being held. This is something that held us together in the time of distress. Mu'mineen, it becomes so very important to be able to do this. That it was August 5, and let me repeat so that some nightmare memories may be evoked, but forgive me for that. But I could not resist the temptation of actually saying this to say what Idi Amin used to call himself. He said, the life president of Uganda, the conqueror of the British Empire, the last king of Scotland had a dream. And he was ordained by the Almighty to expel all actions, repossess their properties, their business, and their money. This happened to us. We had to leave with the clothes on our back. And yet when you look at our community, along with the other communities that were displaced, Leicester in England was a place when the exodus was happening. There were advertisements in the local paper to say, we don't want Ugandan Asians here in our city. Today, 40 years on, that very Leicester community and the City Council of Leicester in England is awarding the Asians for having brought Leicester to its next level of economic development. And this is what we have done as a community wherever we have been. Mu'mineen, this was Amin's thing to say. He said, and this is a quote from his speech, he said, Asians have kept themselves to themselves and as a community have refused to integrate with the Africans. Their main interest has been to exploit the economy. They have been milking our economy for years, and now I say to them all, go. You know, we have to admit that there was some truth in this perception that he had. Not everybody did that. But we have to admit, we have to also take the good with the bad to say there were certain tendencies, and the history teaches us that wherever we live, we must be fully engaged citizens of that land, the land that gives us our risk, that we must be fully engaged in the civic affairs, in the affairs of the rest of humanity. And alhamdulillah, with our institutions at work, the Khoja Shia community, small that it may be, has made a major difference in terms of humanitarian work that we have done through private trust, through the World Federation and other places. So this is something that we learn. With this 90-day ultimatum, 60,000 people had to find a new home. And amongst us, depending on which record one has, the Africa Federation has records to say we had 2,100 people who were displaced. Hassan Bhai Jafar in his book Endangered Species writes that there were 3,000 people from our community who were displaced. 1,500 were British nationals. The rest actually became stateless. And there were people from London, Marum Fida Bhai Dharamsi, and the current General Secretary of Nasimco, Brother Habib M. Habib, amongst others. There may be others here who will correct me. That they actually went from camp to camp in Cyprus, in Malta, in Austria, and other places to see that they were being able to absorb. Rest were in Europe. Again, Mu'mineen, the idea was that level of compassion. So much so that the East African community that had settled in Karachi, who were new, organized themselves under the umbrella of the Panjatani Welfare Society with the cooperation of the Khoja Shia Pirai Jamaat to receive the influx of migrants from Uganda. And this was a commitment that they gave to the Pakistani government. It's amazing that the Pakistani government was not willing to absorb those people who had to become stateless. They needed a guarantee from the Khoja community to say that they will not be a burden on the state. And our people, through the Panjatini Society, were bold enough to say, yes, we will give a guarantee. Mu'mineen, these are the nuances of our history, of our community, as to what we are as a community. Imam Musa Kazim alayhi salam said, and I quote, that if you have a pearl in your hand, and the world says, the people say it's a walnut, it's not going to become a walnut. And if you have a walnut in your hand, and whoever may say it's a pearl, it's not going to become a pearl. Mu'minin, the Khoja Shia Fascist community, as acknowledged by Ayatollah Sistani, as acknowledged by Ayatollah Al-Khoy, as acknowledged by Ayatollah Bakr al-Hakim, and many other of the ulama in the Maraja, have said that the Khoja Shia Fascist community is a cream of the Shia society. It is a pearl of the Shia society. Why? Because of those capabilities and the journey of faith that we undertook. Despite all the other pressures that we had, that we are a community that we are, and that is something that needs to be carried on. It is that spirit that needs to be imbibed and put into our young generation to say, this is our history, this is going to be our future, and between that, this journey of faith will continue on the basis that we become good citizens of where we live, and above all, we become good Muslims, and we become those people who support each other in terms of bir and taqwa, because that is the Quranic injunction for any society. Salawat. Mu'minin, those just a few reminiscences. Does anybody recognize it? This is our mosque in Jinja that we left behind, and our mosque in Soroti that we left behind. Our mosque in Mbale, it's not, you cannot see that. Can we have the pictures? I'll go back. Can we see that? The mosque in Jinja? No? We can. Inshallah, we will post this on the internet, but we have pictures of these mosques, of Mbale, for example, in Soroti, the old mosque of Kampala that we had, and the new compound of the mosque. These are the properties. These are the signs and the testament of a living community that was displaced and that had to go somewhere else. So, this Mu'minin is a history of our community. Now, here is a challenging thing. Where, again in this book, which we are going to launch inshallah today, and you'll also hear briefly, if technology works with us, the actual words and the video of the author himself to say why he wrote the book. But Hassan Bhai Jafar says in his book that I recall a migrant in the UK, a senior reflective migrant in the UK, and he quotes, he said, this gentleman told me, and Hassan Bhai, being a diplomat that he is, does not give the name of this gentleman. So that secret is between him and the gentleman, we will never know. But he said, Idi Amin, the president of Uganda, has deprived us of our wealth and properties and deported us from what we consider to be our homeland. And that was a fact. And then he prophesied. He said, Hassan Bhai writes in the book, that Ted Heath, the British Prime Minister, by giving us shelter in the UK, will end up depriving our progeny of our culture and our faith. Nothing could be further from the truth. When you look at the vibrancy of the community. Mu'minin, we have a pearl. Don't let anybody fool you. Any outsider fool you for their vested interests. To say that we are not a pearl as the Khoja Shia Fascist community. These prophesied words, nothing could be further from the truth. The younger generation and the young professionals at that time took up the challenge, and they continued to create the institutions in the same way that our forefathers had, and that is a result of the Jamaat in Toronto, the Jamaat in Los Angeles, the Jamaat in New York, the Jamaat in Allentown, the Jamaat in Peterborough, in Leicester. Wherever you see all these Jamaats sprung up, exactly modeled on what we had known to have worked. In Mu'minin, this is a basis and the essential thing when it comes to our community. In the epilogue, this book is certainly worth reading and pondering upon. It is indeed a journey of faith as it is, and he has given it the title Endangered Species. Although I was fortunate enough to edit the book, I could not dare to put a question mark against endangered species to say, is it or is it not? Because this is the author's prerogative to say this is an endangered species. Why? And he says this in his epilogue. And he says, language and culture are bonding forces that keep the communities united. With this trend now catching up, the remaining vestiges of a united and a progressive community held together as a result of cultural and ethnic bonds come under stress. As the cultural bond starts eroding, society begins to wither, ending up in diluting much of its original identity. Friends, my young friends, ponder upon this. Ponder upon the value of social capital that we have, the support system that we have. Let us not fritter what has been built upon by our forefathers with great trials and tribulations. You know, great men have to stand on the shoulders of even greater men to climb to where they are. These were the people with broad shoulders who had to come as a small dukawala, slept on the counter of that store. That is how we raised, so that we could see that we have a generation who has a better life than they did. They sold sim-sim, and they sold oil, and they sold things so that the children could go to the UK and elsewhere to get educated. Now it becomes a responsibility of the next generation, because I'm going to talk about and end on this note. Suffice it to say that the remarkable feature of this community has been that no sooner did we settle down in our new lands, as I said, we started engaging ourselves in creating this. Why? Perhaps it was a desire to reenact an external surrounding, to feel, as we were feeling homesick at home, then we created the environment so that we would not feel homesick. Mominin, we need to remember something else too, and this is a message to my elders and my peers, to say that there may have been homesick centers at that time, because we were homesick. We wanted to create this. But the new generation, the millennial generation, what we call the digital natives, we, my peers and my group, we are digital migrants. You know, we actually came to the internet and other things from a typewriter, from a telex and things like that. The new generation growing up here, they have not seen any of this. This is what we call digital natives. They actually grew up with their iPads and their iPods and all that. Something needs to change. We cannot allow our centers to remain homesick centers. There must be wellness centers, spiritual wellness centers for our community. And indeed, that is a transition. That while we continue with our past, we take the good things, we do not put blinkers around us, that we do not change at all. The idea is to continue, to move on to be a progressive society, and meaning that is a pearl that we have. So, this is what I call my generation. A generation who came here either to the West, either for education or was part of the Exodus. You know, to paraphrase Shakespeare, he says, some acquire greatness, some are born great, and some have greatness thrust upon them. Some of us tried to come to the West, we acquired the West. There is a generation that's growing up in the West. But we also have the people who came when they were displaced, they had the West thrust upon them. Whatever the case may be, our generation, my peers, those who are now going towards a social security, and there are so many that we have lost, people like Marhum, Johnny Karmali, amongst others, that this was a generation, this is a generation that is a sandwich generation. On the one hand, they are still obliged to look after their aged parents, and they are concerned about their children and even their grandchildren. And recently I was reading a blog by Salim Sachadina. I don't know whether he's here or not, but I quote him. I take the liberty of quoting him. In his blog he writes, he talks about these stars, this generation, his generation, my generation, Sheikh, your generation, our generation, Mohsin by our generation here. He says the early pioneers of this generation, the brave soldiers of our time, who carried the burden of the whole community that had settled in East Africa for centuries by uprooting it and re-establishing in the West, are now an aging group of soldiers with their heads held high and with dignity. It is true, those words are very true. That alhamdulillah we were able, in the service of Imam Zaman Ajalallahu Faraja Ta'ala, in the service of the community, for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we did what we could. The idea is that A, we have a responsibility to pass this baton over to the next generation, and B, that we must now be flexible enough to give up the reins of power, if I may say so, the reins of that administration to the next generation, so that it comes up and is able to continue at the same vein as we do. And when you look at all this, Mu'mineen, these are the nuances of our history. Therefore, is it any wonder that this engendered a fear in the minds of the Khojas losing their identity? Read this in the book, and it's got some good answers in the epilogue. Would this explain the persistent perseverance by us to remain within a well-knit framework of Jamaat's federation, guarding it so jealously, resisting any intrusion? Where do we go? What do we do? These Mu'mineen are the questions that we need to answer. And understandably, the new generation that we have is questioning the insularity of the community, while the old guard resists any change upon retaining what has worked well for the community for almost a century. These are the balances, Mu'mineen, that we need to make. It's an anthropological study to say, how does a community develop the way that we have? And the question is, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Should we concern ourselves to perpetuate our existence and the development of the community in its present form? What if we cease to exist as a community? And what is the vision that we have for our community? And Mu'mineen, that is an account of the journey of faith by the KSI community, and that is a book that has just been published, that is being first time being released here in the public. And if we have copies here, I would like to see if there is a copy, if we have been able to salvage it. He has. Haider Bhai, please, please recite aloud Nara Salawat to Haider Bhai. Please stay here. Get me copies. 2 copies. Please stay here, Haider Bhai. Mu'mineen, this is the book that we are launching, inshallah, and the book will be available in good numbers. You just saw the exhibition, little brief video. We have the Hajj exhibition, and originally we were going to launch this at the Hajj exhibition. The opportune time seemed to be that while we were here, we were able to also introduce the book to the Mu'mineen. And at this juncture, I would like to call upon the President of Nasimco, Al-Hajj Ghulam Bhai Najafi, to please come up here and receive a copy from the son of the author, Haider Bhai Jafar. There he is. Please welcome him with a loud Nara Salawat. I would also like to call upon our President, Ali Raza Bhai Rajani, to come and receive this copy of the book from Haider Bhai. Mu'mineen, before we recite a few lines of Masaib in the memory of all those that we gathered here today, I request the IT team to play a 2-minute video where Hassan Bhai himself tells us what made him write the book that he did. This book is over, as I said, 500 pages with 2,500 references, and is the most comprehensive book of the history of our community that exists today. So if we can play that video, please.
And greetings from Africa. We are gathered in Mulaska Memorial Library and Research Center today to observe the Hajj exhibition and at the same time to launch this book, The Endangered Species, and or history of the evolution of the Khoja Shia Nansari community. Brothers, some years back, when I was traveling in North America, I was approached by some youngsters who asked me, our ancestors were Hindus in India. When did we become Muslims? Were we converted to Islam by force, since Muslims came to India as conquerors? And it is often narrated in history that the spread of Islam was due to sword. How did we become Muslims? The second question that I was asked at another place was, we are called Khoja. What's the meaning of Khoja? Why do we have to remain as Khoja? If our ancestors were Rohana, Brahmin, or any other tribe in India, why can't we call ourselves Rohana, Brahmin, or Patel and still be Muslims? These are interesting questions which prompted me to look back into the history of our community, our evolution, the rise of Islam in India, and our current state in the West, in Africa, and elsewhere. It took me almost 10 years to research until I was able to produce this book. The manuscript of this book was almost ready 2 years back. For one thing or the other, publication of this book was delayed. At last, we are able to launch this book, The Endangered Species.
So, Mu'min, there you have it. You hear from the author. Hopefully, our community continues with the great habit, dare I say, of reading. Inshallah, that we will partake of this book. The book will be available at the bookshop here and elsewhere, at the Mullah Askar Memorial Center and other places.
The centre of Kampala, Uganda's bustling capital city. Today, there's not an Asian face apart from mine in sight. But pre-1972, it was a very different picture.
So where are we? We're on the main Kampala road. Very busy, as you can see. The road comes from Old Kampala, Bakuli, which many Indians would remember.
My cousin Bharat Manik was also expelled by Amin. 5 years ago, he returned to Uganda to work as a teacher and says he can remember the streets as a child.
And what I really remember is all I could see was Indian families walking around. There were very few local people at that time in the evening. You can see there are not many around now at all.
On the 4th of August 1972, Idi Amin announced that Asians were milking the Ugandan economy. Within weeks, we were given 90 days to leave the country. Long queues formed outside the British High Commission, and by late September, 30 flights a week were leaving from Entebbe Airport for Stansted. I was only 2 when we left. Stories of that time have come second-hand. So I really wanted to see where I was born and where my father had run a shop in Uganda. And it was on a sugar plantation outside of Kampala. So I'm on the journey from Kampala to Kierkegaard, just over an hour or so. It's a beautiful drive, but that hour feels quite long, actually, because it's quite nerve-wracking. I'm going to the place that I was actually born. I'm looking forward to seeing my dad's shop, and maybe finding some people that remember him as well. I'm excited, but I'm quite nervous. We'll see what happens when we get there, I suppose. Henry, I'm Rufo.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Welcome back to Uganda.
Thank you very much. Jambo.
Jambo.
Kierkegaard Sugar Plantation is owned by one of Uganda's most successful returning Asian families, the Madvanis. They introduced me to one of their staff, Henry, who was a driver when my dad ran the shop all those years ago. About 47 years?
Yes.
This is a picture of my mum, again, much older.
Yeah.
Do you recognise her?
That face I can remember.
Honestly?
Yes, I honestly remember that face. The face is not changed.
He agreed to take me to the shop my father ran when he lived here. My name is Rupal. Oh, my papa,
Adukan Chalauta. My dad used to run this place, he used to manage this place before 1972. And
The experience was much more emotional than I expected. I could really imagine what it must have been like for my family to have left all this behind.
to imagine that my dad was here and just to know the silly things like the shelves are the same.
My parents never came back, but some did. Nimisha Madvani's family owned this plantation. I had to ask if there was any truth in the accusation.
Asians have kept themselves apart as a closed community and have refused to integrate with Ugandan Africans.
Idi Amin was a very calculating, cunning, and very devious person, but he had the habit and the knack of disarming his enemies until he had the opportunity of getting rid of them, perhaps physically. So he was a very clever man. He was intelligent, he was uneducated, he was brutal, he was ruthless, but he was effective in what he did for himself and his cronies.
I have very tragic memories of Idi Amin because I can now reflect back on the bodies that I saw hanging from trees, the bodies, dead bodies in the rivers and the red water. And so don't have very fond memories of Idi Amin and what he did to the country. I think he just destroyed what is a beautiful, beautiful country. And to me, Uganda and especially Mbale is like heaven on earth.